Hi class. In today's lesson, we're going to move on from basic formatting in our spreadsheets to learning a little bit about how to use Formulae. Now, in my opinion, this is probably one of the most useful things to learn about spreadsheets, and even if you don't plan to do anything career-wise, which might be really spreadsheet heavy, this is a really useful skill just for life because you can use it for budgeting, working at costs, for all sorts of stuff. So you may find this useful. You may even find it useful to show your parents how to do it if you ever fancy doing something clever like doing a monthly budget for the household or working out your kind of shopping budgets, things like that. But anyway, let's get to the point. So what you need to do, if you're on our classroom, you should have made your way to this assignment already called Formulae. And within that, you will find there are two things that you may want to use. One is the set of slides, which I have open already, so I'm going to use them as we go through the lessons. You can open that yourself though, because you might find it easier just to read along with that as you're doing sections of the task. And you'll also need your copy of the task, which is this here. Okay, this is the spreadsheet of the tasks. Now, on that spreadsheet, I have zoomed mine in. Again, I've zoomed mine in. I'm going to zoom it out a wee bit. So by default, it looks a bit like this. And in this case, there's loads of space that we don't need. So just to make it a bit clearer for you, I've used Control-Shift, and then I've used the plus button so that I can zoom in on the spreadsheet itself. And that allows it just to be a little bit clearer for you. And if you're using your Chromebook, you might find this a little bit easier to manage because it just makes everything a little bit bigger. So anyway, let's have a quick look at what we need to do. We're going to learn how to create simple formulas, and we're going to create more complex formulae as we move through it. But basically, if you have been able to write formula that can perform common calculations like multiplication, subtraction, adding, all that sort of stuff, then you've basically hit the nail on the head in terms of our first success criteria. What I also like is that you can use something called absolute referencing when you're writing a formula. And to be honest, there's not much point in explaining that at this stage because it won't really make sense until we've seen when we use it. It will make sense later in the lesson though. So as I say, you need to open up this spreadsheet. And when we talked about spreadsheets in the first lesson, one of the key points I wanted to get across is that the huge value of spreadsheets, which makes them different from just normal tables, is that you can get them to do some pretty intelligent stuff for you. You can make them work out mathematical formulas and calculate things for you. So for example, simple things like adding up, getting percentages, all that sort of kind of stuff. You can get it to do it for you, and you get it to do it really quickly and efficiently. And it seems like it'd be really complicated, but actually when you learn a couple of the rules about how it works and how to write the formulas, it's actually really very simple to do simple formulas. And when you get your head around that, the more complex stuff kind of starts to fall into place too. So we're going to start with a couple of really basic things. If you look at the first task here, I'll just explain the context of this. So this is a kind of an example spreadsheet, imagining it was for analysing the wages in a business for seasonal staff that work certain hours. So we've got our staff down here and the department they work in here. We've also got the number of hours they've worked, what the rate of pay is, so that's how much they earn per hour, how many hours of overtime they've worked. So overtime is when you work more than your normal hours. So maybe your normal hours would be 40 hours, and that means this person's worked an additional 2. And in normal circumstances, when you work more than your standard hours, you can get an overtime rate, which is usually where your pay will increase for that additional time. So we'll add that in later. Your gross pay is basically just the total amount of pay that you've earned. So that's without any deductions like tax or so on. Deductions might be all sorts of things, but generally that's things like taxes and pension contributions. So we also have to factor that in order to get what we call our net pay. And the net pay is what we earned after taking all those deductions off. So if we were to try and work this out one at a time for every single cell with a calculator, it would take a really long time. And from a business point of view, that's just really silly because you want to be as efficient as possible and save yourself time and money. So we're going to teach the spreadsheet to do a lot of that maths for us and work out a lot of this information, very little effort from us. Now, the first thing that you'll see it asks us to do is to click on cell D6, and we need to format it so that it's all currency. At the moment, it's just that one there, and we want all the data from D7 to D11 to be currencies as well, because it's all about money here. So this one here is currency. We're going to highlight all of these. So we're going to just click and drag over them all, and we're going to go up here and click on Format as Currency. You'll see that that's now changed them all to being currency. That's handy because it means that when we do calculations based on these cells, it will know that the results of those calculations should be in money. So it will format these as well. Now, the next thing we need to do is in cell B13, so if you look for column B, cell 13 or row 13, so that's going to be this cell here, we need to put in what the deductions are going to be. And the deductions, for the sake of simplicity, we're going to make them 7%. So that means that whatever you earn, you'll lose 7% of that for whatever reason, tax, etc. So we're going to put in there 0.07. Now, 0.07 as part of 1, if we think about that as a percentage, is just 7%. And so if we were to change the format of that cell, so it's percent, you'll see that now appears as 7%. We're pretty much ready to start putting in some other information. So let's have a look back at the first formulas that we're going to need to use. To make a cell calculate what value it displays from values in other cells, we can add a formula. And the great thing about this is it will automatically update if other cells are changed at a later point. So if we change, for example, the number of hours that somebody works in one cell, it'll automatically update the total of how much they earn to reflect the changes in the other cells that it's dependent on. That makes spreadsheets really useful because, again, we can use them over and over again, and we can just change the values in them, and they'll still do the same calculations for us without us having to do anything else. Now, there are a couple of simple rules to remember about formulas, and the first and most important one is that they always start with an equals symbol. If you don't put the equals symbol in, it doesn't know there's a formula there, and it just won't work. In addition to that, we also need to use common mathematical symbols like the plus, minus. We use an asterisk for a multiplication, which some people find confusing because you might think it would be the X key, but it's important to make sure that you understand it's the asterisk, and that should be above your number 8 key on your keyboard. And we also use a forward slash for division. We can also use brackets, which is something you would probably be familiar with from maths because you use those to bracket or to group certain parts of calculations. And we use the cell references to stand for values. So for example, if I wanted to take what was in cell 1, cell A1, plus B1 and times it by 2, that's the formula down here that I would write. So I would type in equals, then in brackets I would put A1 plus B1, close brackets, multiplied by 2. And that would then mean that in whatever cell I had written that formula, it would display the answer to that calculation. Hopefully that makes sense, and if it doesn't, don't worry, because it will become kind of more apparent when we actually work through the examples. So the first formulas that we need to add in are really quite straightforward, and I'll talk you through them a little bit at a time. So what I would encourage you to do is watch the video a little at a time, complete that part of the formula, then come back to the video after you've finished it, pause, back and forth. Just work your way through it using the video as you need to. So let's first of all find the right cell. Cell F6, if we have a look here, is going to be in column F, row 6. So that means this is the cell we're looking for. That's cell F6. The formula that we're going to put in there is equals D6 times 1.5. So I'm going to type in equals D6 times 1.5. I'm going to show you something else quite handy in a wee moment, but we'll just type that in to keep it simple for now. Hit enter, and you'll see that it's automatically taken whatever was in cell D6 and multiplied it by 1.5. And that tells us the overtime rate, which is what we call time and a half. So it's what your average rate of, or your normal rate of pay is, multiplied by 1.5 to make it a little bit higher. Now, you saw that an autofill option came up, which kind of sneaks past what I wanted to teach you how to do properly. You will find that those autofills are useful to use, but I want to just take some time to explain how you would do it manually so you understand. So I'm going to ignore that autofill, and we'll come back to that later. The G6 cell is going to have this formula, so we're going to just type in there equals, and then we're going to have in brackets C6 times D6. So just to speed this process up, what I'm going to show you is that you can actually just click on cells rather than typing them. So we're going to have C6, which is this one, times D6 So you can see that just by clicking on them, it enters the values. We can close brackets, plus E6 times F6 in brackets. So we're going to open the brackets, click on E6, and then F6 times first and F6. Okay, so there we go. And we can hit enter. Again, we're going to just ignore the autofill for now, but in future you might find that useful. Our deductions is going to be G6. So G6 is our gross pay. That's how much we've earned. So we're going to do equals that. And we're going to multiply it by a percentage, which is 7%. So we're going to do, as you'll see here, times B13. So we're going to do times and then select B13, hit enter. So that's telling us what 7% of this is. And our net pay is going to be G6 minus H6. So that's our gross pay minus our deductions. So that's going to be equals G6 minus H6. So we're going to say equals that minus, oh, sorry, back to front, silly me, equals that minus that. There we go. So we've worked out all of the figures for Rashinda here in terms of her overtime rate, how much she's earned as a total, which is basically how many hours she's worked at her normal rate of pay plus however many overtime hours she's worked at her overtime rate. We've worked out what her deductions are that she needs to pay, so we now know her net pay. So we didn't really actually have to do any of the calculations ourselves. We just put in the formulas that will do it, and they've worked out for us. What we can now do, though, and this is the really handy thing, is we can use something called relative referencing in order to repeat that process. Because it would be quite time consuming if I had to go through, maybe I had a company with 300 employees and I had to go through and type those formulas out for every single cell. It'd probably just take me as long as it would to work out the numbers. But what we can do to speed the process up is use something called relative referencing. And that just means that I can copy a formula, but as I paste that formula into other cells, the references, which is to say the cells that it calculates its value from, change relative to where we copy it to. And a simple way to do that is we can either just copy and paste, so we can just use Control-C, Control-V, okay? Or if we have numerous ones to do it, you'll see this little blue box at the bottom here. We can click on that and just make sure you've got it. You'll see that your cursor turns into a little, like a plus sign. So click and drag that, and it will take those formulas, or that formula, and it will copy it into all of these other cells. The clever thing you'll notice, if we look up at the top here, in this area, it says that the top one is D6 times 1.5, but you'll notice that when I copied it down, that number has automatically changed, so it now references the figures in row 7. And as we go down, 8, 9, 10, and so on. So when we copied it down, it automatically knew that because I was copying the formula from here down into here, that instead of taking the values from this row, it now has to take the values from this row. Hopefully that makes sense. Now we can do that for the other cells if we go along, just copy that down. And we'll come to a problem with it in a moment. You'll notice that deductions hasn't worked, but we'll come to why that is in a wee moment. So we've now basically done all of these calculations after only inputting a few formulas. And if you were doing this without the process or the time involved in going through a video, you'd actually find it was a lot quicker. So we're going to move on now to the last thing, which is fixing this issue with deductions and why that happened. The problem that we have is that the formula doesn't work because the reference to B13 has changed when we copy it down. So in this one here, we are taking G6 times B13, so that's G6 there, and we're multiplying that against B13, which is this one. Now when we copy it down, it's taking that G7, okay, but you'll see that it's trying to multiply it by B14, which is one down, and there's nothing there. So when it tries to multiply that figure by, you know, the cells which are below here, because of relative referencing, it thinks it's got to go one cell down every time we copy it one cell down. Likewise, by the time we get down to here, it's trying to multiply by B18, which also has nothing in it. So basically, in this formula, if we're going to copy it, what we need to do is we need to say, okay, well, it's fine for relative referencing to change for this first cell, but we need it to always refer to this cell here, B13. So what we do is simply change that to what's called absolute referencing, and we can do that by adding a dollar symbol before the letter and the number. Now, we can do it individually for the letter or the number, but I'm not going to get bogged down in explaining that for now. Really, just we can absolute reference for either a single row or a single column rather than the row and column, but we'll keep it simple just by having $B, $13. Now, you'll actually see that when we look at that, it hasn't changed it because this one was right anyway. But if we copy it down again, you'll find that these ones now do work. And if we look at them, you'll see that that's because when we look at the formula, although this first number is going down one row at a time, okay, the second section, B13, is always referring to this cell here, which is what it needed to do. So we've now basically finished our spreadsheet, and it now tells us all we need to know about our employees' overtime rates, how much they've earned as a total, as their gross pay, how much their deductions are, and what their net pay was. So hopefully you'll agree that that was a really kind of an effective way of quickly working some not terribly complicated, but time-consuming figures out without an awful lot of effort. There's a second task which we'd now move on to, but I would like to leave this up to your discretion. If you have managed to do this quite quickly, then that's great, and you can maybe just move on to the second task. But if you found that it's taking you a really long time to get through this one, and you've really struggled with it, don't worry so much about the second one. You can see it's more of an extension task. So I'd encourage you to try it to consolidate your knowledge. But as I say, don't spend more than the period that you're kind of really supposed to spend on this task. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to stop this video, and then I'll make a second video that deals with that second part of the task.